I was brought up in the Betty Crocker era. You had to get married and you had to have children.
It was as if a great floodlight had gone on.
Our minds were being blown. I just wanted to say it. I wanted to write it and speak it.
It was exhilarating because we were breaking new ground.
You gotta blow a loud trumpet. You gotta beat the drum loudly.
Meet the Makers right now on PBS.
A record field of 601 starters braved chilly winds and a steady drizzle in the 71st Boston Marathon.
The 1967 Boston Marathon was run in some of the worst conditions in race history. While most of the crowd was focused on the front of the pack, another runner was making a stir far behind.
The idea of running long distance was always considered very questionable for women because, you know, an arduous activity would mean that you're going to get big legs and grow a mustache and hair on your chest and your uterus was going to fall out.
In 1967, Kathrine Switzer was a junior at Syracuse University. Because Syracuse had no women's track team, she began training with the manager of the men's team, a part-time mailman named Arnie Briggs.
It was Arnie who told me about the greatest day in his life every year, which was the Boston Marathon. And we were out running, and Arnie began telling me another Boston Marathon story. And I said, oh, Arnie, let's just quit talking about the darn marathon and run it. And my dream then became to prove that I could run 26 miles, 385 yards.
For 70 years, the Boston Marathon had excluded women. But Switzer entered using just her initials.
We walked to the start, and the gun went off, and down the street we went. So there we were, Arnie Briggs, the 50-year-old mailman, and me, the 20-year-old college student, and my boyfriend, Tom Miller, the ex-All-American football player. When other runners would come by, they would say, oh, it's a girl, and they were so excited. And all of a sudden, the press truck is in front of us, and they're taking, you know, pictures of us. On this truck was the race director, the feisty guy by the name of Jock Semple. He just stopped the bus, jumped off, and ran after me. And he just grabbed me and screamed at me, get the hell out of my race and give me those numbers. He had the fiercest face of any guy I'd ever seen. And all of a sudden, Big Tom, my boyfriend, came with a streak and gave Jock the most incredible crossbody block and sent Jock flying right through the air and landed on the curb. And all of this happened in front of the press truck. Journalists got very aggressive. What are you trying to prove? You know, are you a suffragette? Are you a crusader? Whatever that is, you know? And I said, what? I'm just trying to run. Then it got very quiet. Snow's coming down. Nobody's saying anything. And I turned to Arnie and I said, Arnie, I'm gonna finish this race on my hands and my knees if I have to. If I don't finish this race, then everybody's gonna believe women can't do it. I've got to finish this race. I finished that race in 4 hours, 20 minutes. It wasn't until we stopped on the thruway to get an ice cream and some coffee that we see the newspapers and the coverage front and back of all the different editions with the pictures. I realized that now this was very, very important, and this was going to change my life, and it was probably going to change women's sports. There is an expression in a marathon that you do go through sort of a lifetime of experience. And I often say that I started the Boston Marathon as a girl, and I finished the Boston Marathon as a grown woman.
For the high school graduates of the 1950s, life looked good.
Wishing and hoping and thinking and praying.
America was booming, creating a prosperous new middle class. For boys, the future held almost limitless possibilities. But society did not see as much promise for girls.
You go to college, you get a degree in education in case, God forbid, you ever have to go to work. And while you're there, you damn well better meet the man you're going to marry, because otherwise, where else are you going to meet him? All the women I know married before we were out of college. We didn't have a chance to grow up. We didn't have a chance to find out what we might have been able to do.
There were an awful lot who thought you should get your MRS degree, you know, I mean, and then you were going to be taken care of. It was like you were carried away on this wonderful barge, and life was good from then on.
As each girl got engaged in my class, they would raise their hands like this so that you could see the diamond. That's what it was about. The ring, the silver pattern, the china. I was pregnant by the time I graduated, and I hung my diploma over the washing machine.
For middle-class American women, the ideal was to get married and then to cheerfully assume their proper place in the home as wives and mothers.
I wish. I just wish I had a decent kitchen.
I turned 20 in 1952. There was very heavy propaganda everywhere to live the good life, which meant in a small house with your children and your husband, preferably in the suburbs, and that was it.
I want to be happy, but I won't be happy till I make you happy too.
Everywhere, it seemed, the culture was reinforcing the image of the happy homemaker.
You were supposed to be always perky and pretty and cheerful, never to have moods, and never to be serious either. I don't remember any actual serious, smart woman in television or in advertising in those years.
Wife, I said, pay attention, because I'm going to teach you how to make coffee.
It wasn't always so for American women.
The girl I left behind has the job I left behind.
During World War II, many women were working in factories, building the tanks and airplanes vital to the war effort.
In the United States today, no large business office or store could even hope to function efficiently without women.
By the early 1950s, female workers had swapped tanks and airplanes for typewriters and mimeograph machines. Though the number of women in the workplace gradually increased throughout the decade, their jobs were almost always low-paying and dead-end.
When I first got out of college and applied for jobs, there were pink cards in the employment agencies for women to fill out and blue cards for men to fill out. If you opened the New York Times, you saw help wanted men, help wanted women. And you could not apply for a job in the men's column because you wouldn't get through the door. There was absolutely no way of crossing that barrier.
Your high score on the Scholastic Aptitude Test indicates that you can become a good secretary.
As dismal as were the jobs held by most white women, they were high-paid careers next to those available to African Americans.
I had one goal, and that was if only I could one day work in an office, because every woman that I knew was doing housework. By that I mean they were maids.
Even those women advantaged by the best educations had almost no shot at a high-paying professional job.
At the law school, there was a bulletin board, and it had notices on it from many law firms, Stanford law graduates. Give us a call. I called every phone number on the bulletin board. They said, oh, well, we didn't mean women. We don't hire women.
Even if they held jobs for a time, most middle-class women eventually became homemakers. Tucked behind white picket fences, they were supposed to be settled and happy. Some were, but more and more felt like something was missing.
Here they were, they had better lives than their mothers or their grandmothers. They were living in better homes. And they were thinking to themselves, I ought to be the happiest person in the world, but they weren't.
I lived on a cul-de-sac in suburban New Jersey, maybe 30 houses, and there wasn't one woman in any of those houses who worked. And when I started to do this, when I wanted to write, they laughed at me. They laughed at me. What makes you think you can do this?
There was something wrong with you if you weren't happy. You weren't normal somehow. You weren't doing what you were supposed to do as a wife and a mother. And if you had 4 beautiful children like I did, how could you possibly complain about your life? I felt inside very alienated from the world. I felt there was something horrifically wrong with me, that I would want anything other than what I had.
A year ago, this woman heaved a brick through the rose-colored picture window of the American suburban bungalow and invited the resident housewife to take a clear look at the outside world. This book has sold more than 50,000 copies in the hardcover edition, and 700,000 have been published in paperback.
In 1963, a writer named Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, her scathing expose of the happy homemaker myth.
The feminine mystique has made us feel it's unfeminine to use our rights, to really want equality, to want to take part in the decisions of the world in politics. Career woman almost became a dirty word.
Betty Friedan had given up the chance for an academic career to become a homemaker and part-time journalist in the 1950s. Feeling there was something missing in her own life, she wondered if other women felt the same way.
She decided to interview her old classmates at Smith prior to a reunion. In doing that, she surfaced a deep sense of malaise among women who had very fine educations and then felt that they really didn't have choices, that there were no avenues for their talents, and were caught in some profound way.
A woman today has been made to feel freakish and alone and guilty if simply she wants to be more than her husband's wife, her children's mother, if she really wants to use her abilities in society. And
everybody read The Feminine Mystique. And of course, we all had mothers who suffered from the problem that has no name. They didn't know what was wrong. Why were they not satisfied by the 3 children and the perfect house?
Up until that time, I was thinking that I was just different. A lot of my girlfriends were getting married straight out of college, and I was thinking, I don't want to do that at all. But reading that book let me know that there were masses of women who felt differently, and that, it was stunning.
But to the women content with their traditional roles, The Feminine Mystique felt like a slap in the face.
I first read The Feminine Mystique in the winter of 1964. I felt personally judged. All these things that women at home can do, which are extremely worthwhile to society, were dismissed as dilettantism and unworthy of any respect.
However it was received, Betty Friedan's book was certainly timely, as women's rights was beginning to surface as a national issue. In 1963, President Kennedy issued a report finding widespread discrimination against women in the workplace.
It was an historic occasion, the passage of the Civil Rights Bill.
The next year, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. Title VII of the Act barred unequal treatment on the basis of race or religion. In a surprise, last-minute move, Congress included a ban on gender discrimination as well. Few took the provision on gender seriously. Even the director of the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, the new agency created to enforce the law, called it a fluke. Eileen Hernandez, who had risen through the ranks of the labor movement, was the only woman on the commission.
Some of our commissioners were not taking action because essentially they were dealing with the race issues that they were familiar with. The first case that I remember that we really had a big discussion about sex discrimination was the airlines.
Come fly with me, let's fly away.
We were the first jet setters.
If you can use
walking down the street in your uniform, you could turn ahead. People would go, I heard that airlines were having an interview in town. It was in a motel, and he would call them in one at a time. And it was my turn to go into the bedroom, and the first thing he said was hold up your skirt. And I said, excuse me? And he's, let me see your legs.
An important part of this crew is the smiling stewardess. To qualify on most airlines, she must be single and between the ages of 21 and 28. She must be between 5'2" and 5'6" in height and of normal weight.
They taught us how to put makeup on and how to do our hair, how to squat down so you didn't show anything if you're going to be in the aisle and you had to kneel down.
They would give us girdle checks. You had to wear girdles. Everything was checked. Uniform clean, makeup good, everything, right down the aisle. It was almost like, open your mouth, let me check your teeth like a horse.
When I started flying, I was 26 at the time. I thought, oh man, I could make a whole career out of this. And then I realized that I can't. They're going to fire me when I'm 32 years old.
In 1953, anyone that was hired after that date was fired at age 32. That was it. They came on the airplane with the bundle of roses and said goodbye.
I was called into the supervisor's office, and she said, well, happy birthday. I said, thank you very much. She said, you know what that means, don't you? At 32, I was too old to be out in public anymore. You should be home married and having children. You shouldn't be on the airplane. Leave that up to the young, pretty girls.
Furious, the stewardesses marched to Washington to file a claim with the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission.
We were the first case. We went down July 1st, 1965, EEOC in Washington. Walked in, they hadn't even unpacked the typewriter.
The EEOC expected mainly black people coming in, and to see two white women coming in there saying I'm just being discriminated against because of my age, that was just kind of peculiar.
We're getting complaints from every place at this point in time on the issue of race. Nobody had done anything on the issue of discrimination against women, and they suddenly had to do something.
But in fact, the EEOC did nothing. Under pressure from the airlines, they refused to act.
I quit. I quit because we were not moving on any of these cases. I had learned a long time ago that if you do your best to get something done, and if it's not moving, you don't stay there and keep waiting for it to move. You go out somewhere and start pushing them to move.
Eileen Hernandez joined a small group of female lawyers and politicians who had watched and waited in vain for the EEOC to act.
These women were extremely frustrated when they discovered that they could not push the EEOC to go further. They had this very exciting meeting at which they decided we're going to go outside the bounds of the structure. We're going to form our own organization.
Betty Friedan came up with the name National Organization for Women. She and two other people worked on the declaration, and they finally have an organization.
The National Organization for Women, or NOW, invited Betty Friedan to be its first president.
What is it you're trying to do? Well, we are really trying to do something about, for instance, the conditions that prevent women from easily combining marriage and motherhood and work in the professions.
Like the NAACP, now chose a legal strategy, looking for test cases they could use to challenge discriminatory laws. They focused on an obscure case wending its way through the Georgia courts in the fall of 1967. Lorena Weeks was a telephone operator in Wadley, Georgia, struggling to get by with 3 children. She sued Southern Bell because they had blocked her advancement in the company.
I worked because I had to. I didn't have any other choice. There were just a lot of jobs that women were not allowed to do. Cable repairman, a test deskman, a toll test, a switchman. It just goes on and on and on. But I was always looking. If there was any way any one of those jobs came open, I would want it because it meant so much more money.
But heaven help the working girl in a world that's run by men.
When an opening for switchman came up, Weeks applied. By Southern Bell's own seniority rules, the job should have been hers.
It was maintaining the equipment within the central office. And it's just as easy as it could be and just so much fun.
Weeks' application was turned down. She was told by her superior that the job was reserved for men.
He says, Lorena, I have nothing against you, but you know, if you win this position, we'll have to give it to other women. I said, well, that's exactly what this is all about. He said, well, you know, the man's the breadwinner in the family. I said, oh, no. When I go through the grocery line in the grocery store, they don't push back a loaf of bread and say, you're a nice little lady, you can have this 10 cents cheaper just because I'm a woman.
Weeks sued Southern Bell. In court, the company successfully argued that they were merely protecting women from having to lift equipment weighing as much as 30 pounds.
Most any woman, if they ever held a baby, they could lift 30 pounds. It wasn't a protective thing to keep women out of these jobs. It was keeping them away from making more money.
The National Organization for Women provided a young lawyer, Sylvia Roberts, to handle Weeks' appeal. During the trial, Roberts arranged for several objects weighing more than 30 pounds to be brought into the courtroom.
These pieces of equipment were supposed to be beyond Lorena's capability, and I lifted all of those, and I pointed out that I wasn't even an average-sized woman.
Sylvia was a tiny little woman. She didn't even weigh 100 pounds. She was a little thing.
Even after Roberts' demonstration, the case dragged on for nearly 2 years, but Weeks refused to give up.
Why'd I fight so hard? Because I knew, like myself and my mother, how hard you had to work to make a living. A lone woman has to work and pay debts just like the man does.
Finally, in March 1969, a federal appeals court ruled in Weeks' favor, stating that Title VII rejects this type of romantic paternalism. The promise of Title VII is that women are now to be on equal footing.
Weeks' case gave momentum to now because it showed that we as women could use the system, that we could achieve this equality under the law. It wasn't fanciful. It wasn't a pie in the sky. It could be done, and we did it.
From the Weeks case, now moved on to other important victories, including the end of segregated help wanted ads and male-only clubs and restaurants. But the organization and the movement itself were limited, concerned largely with the travails of white middle-class women.
Black women were initially perplexed about how they should respond to the women's movement. Its first face was a white face. They associated white women with white men. That meant white privilege. How are we to respond?
I think feminism was perceived to be white women's work, not black women's work. And I think feminism was perceived to be something that you needed to stay away from because it wasn't going to help African-American community.
For most black women, the preoccupations of middle-class white women seemed a world away.
Here we were we who were black women unable to raise our families if two people didn't get out and work. And what you have among white people are women who have the leisure to sit at home. What do we have in common with those people?
By the waters of Babylon, where we sat down.
For years, black women had been lending their energy to the civil rights movement, excelling as organizers and occasionally assuming highly public leadership roles.
Now is the time to be aware of what's going on in the state of Mississippi.
I remember the day that I realized that I could be a principal in my own life. And that was really a revolutionary thought.
Many college-age white women flocked south to join the struggle, where they were inspired by the example of their black sisters.
My first employment in the civil rights movement had me working for a black woman. She was not only the first black woman I'd ever had as a boss, she was the first woman I'd ever had as a boss. It was the beginning of my own emancipation.
Radicalized by their experiences in civil rights, these younger women began to look at their own lives differently.
We were talking about freedom and equality, and some of the women who were in the civil rights movement started applying the principles to themselves as women.
Women could not fail but make the comparison with race and understand that just as there needed to be a racial liberation movement, there needed to be a women's liberation movement. Whenever one person stands up and says, wait a minute, this is wrong, it helps other people to do the same.
The civil rights and anti-war movements not only inspired younger women, but also exposed them to deep sexism, even within their own ranks.
My experience in those movements was suddenly one of discovering that I was a natural leader, and yet men were not letting me and other women rise as natural leaders.
A woman and her man would come home from demonstrations exhausted from being beat up by cops or being busted or whatever, and he would lie down on the sofa and wipe the tear gas out of his eyes and say, wow, it was really hard. And she'd say, yeah, and wipe the tear gas out of her eyes and go and make dinner. The bad behavior by guys in the left was particularly heartbreaking to us because we were young, idealistic women thinking we were making the revolution together. Out of that context, the first autonomous, radical feminist groups began to form.
It was a campus meeting of Students for a Democratic Society, and I was talking before the group, and one of the guys in the group said, shut up. And I finished speaking. I then went around the room and tapped all the women on the shoulder, who were probably over 50% of the people there, and said, let's leave and go upstairs and talk on our own.
When the truth is found to be lies.
These women were angry, and they were organized from having been in other movements. They were disciplined, and they knew how to create a movement. They had done it. They had done it with men. Now they could do it for themselves.
All over America, pretty much spontaneously almost, in college communities and big cities, these groups would develop. And what came out of it was similar problems, similar ways of being treated by the world, and often similar desires.
These young women had a much more sweeping vision of change than their sisters in now. They called it women's liberation.
It was heady and exciting and naive, imagining that if we just explained it to people, it was so unjust that surely it would change.
Marriage is, as I've said, is unpaid labor. I mean, no woman, it's a free household slave for each man.
Society itself would have to take major collective responsibility for the care and the rearing of children.
Every man oppresses women.
I mean, they have the chance to oppress the women they marry.
Meeting in small groups, women began to discuss their private experiences for the first time. They called it consciousness raising.
Consciousness raising was the thing. That is how we learned about our lives. That is how we learned that we were not alone in what was happening to us.
These first small groups began to compare notes, and whenever an oppressed people compare notes, it's just bloody dynamite, you know, because first of all, it's the you too moment.
What we discovered was we all had fathers who browbeat our mothers. We all went out for jobs and only found that we could look in the women jobs wanted column. We all faked orgasms.
Did I ever fake an orgasm? Oh, you bet I faked an orgasm.
You gotta understand, our minds were being blown. Everything was wide open, and it was a very scary, fertile, exciting, exhilarating time.
The new ideas of women's liberation, born in consciousness-raising groups, jumped from campus to campus and city to city.
It spread very, very fast. I can't believe how fast it spread. So many radical ideas could be passed on. For example, there would be a conference at Berkeley, and all these pamphlets about sexuality, about childcare, about education, any item that affected women, all these pamphlets would be sitting on a table. Where did they come from?
I read my way into feminism. I read The Myth of the Vaginal Orgasm. I read Housework is a Women's Issue. I read stuff I would never have encountered otherwise that radicalized me.
Women drew from their most intimate personal experiences a whole new worldview. They coined a phrase for it. The personal is political.
It was as if a great floodlight had gone on and illuminated not only all of my experience, but everything in the world. And I was able to see how everything that I had thought about or cared about was connected, and there was so much to be done.
There she is, Miss America.
In 1968, women's liberationists introduced themselves to the American public with a protest against one of America's most cherished institutions.
Girls all over the country would watch the Miss America pageant and think, oh, that's the model, that's what I've got to be like.
The winner should have talent, looks, personality, looks, poise, and looks. Everybody's got talent.
They were supposed to have a talent like baton twirling, but not to be an artist. They were supposed to feel comfortable in high heels and bathing suits, parading around while men whistled.
This year's crop seems to be the most beauteous bevy of breathtaking beauties in decades.
At the time of the Miss America pageant, Robin Morgan was an anti-war activist.
I announced that I was thinking of organizing this thing at Atlantic City, and all of the men couldn't believe it. They said, but that's just a women's thing. How can you, I mean, it's just a Miss America, oh my God.
On September 7th, Morgan and hundreds of other women gathered on the boardwalk outside the Atlantic City Convention Center.
We did have a sense of humor, and we had a certain panache of outrageousness.
We had a freedom trash can in which we threw what we called objects of women's oppression, like brooms and dustpans and curlers, high-heeled shoes and bras and girdles. Oh, those girdles.
I threw my 16-year-old son's Playboy magazines in it. And I said something like, women, use your brains.
We crowned a live sheep on the boardwalk because Miss America and the contestants were sheep. I disagree with this. First of all, it was unfair to the sheep.
At a certain point, a small group went inside. They had a huge banner with the words, Women's Liberation. And when the TV cameras were panning the audience up in the balcony, they unfurled the banner. And all over the country, everybody saw those words,
women's liberation.
Though few in number, women's liberationists knew how to turn bold public actions into media coverage, expanding the reach of their ideas.
30 seconds on the 6 o'clock news was more important than leafleting on a corner on the Lower East Side for 6 years.
Somebody would come up with a great idea. Then it would just go like wildfire through this small community of radical feminists. The date would be set, and we would just show up.
Oh, you're the strong, silent type. Those men, those sex objects.
There was the Whistle Inn on Wall Street.
Those pants, they just bring out your best.
We all went down there and started pinching the guys who came out of the offices,
Oh, what a chapeau. How about glasses? I like them with glasses.
whispering in their ears and pawing them, and they didn't like it at all.
Look at the legs on that one.
Women militants, objecting to what they consider male supremacy, have been making themselves heard rather widely recently. Today, their target was the male editor of a magazine for women.
Women's magazines provided a particularly rich target for women's liberation.
I'm a girl, and by me that's only great. I am proud that my silhouette is curvy.
Read by millions, Glamour, Redbook, and especially the Ladies' Home Journal promoted a stereotype of the happy homemaker loathed by feminists.
Women's magazines were reporting on how to make potholders into lampshades, 42 ways to make hamburger, how to make your husband happy.
I had suggested it would be a really interesting idea to have a sit-in at one of these big, slick women's magazines that was run by a man. And then someone in the group said, how about the Ladies' Home Journal?
The day of the takeover, we met outside the building where the Ladies' Home Journal offices were. We were all dressed like ladies in skirts. We went into the building in very small groups of 3 or 4 people so that they wouldn't know anything was going on. Eventually got inside the office of the editor-in-chief and said that we weren't going to leave until he gave us the opportunity to have a whole issue.
What are you going to do about them? Are you going to negotiate with these girls?
I'm good.
All right, let's talk to them again.
The editor of the Ladies' Home Journal was a soft-spoken Southerner named John Mack Carter.
He's a tiny man, you know, and he was sitting at this big desk with the little woman who was his assistant helping him, trying to talk to
I
us.
think women's liberation is very weak on. Well, what do you think of the demand?
We demand that the magazine cease to further the exploitation of women by publishing ads from companies that exploit women in terms of salary and job discrimination.
How do you determine that?
Here's one. It's an advertisement for Jell-O pudding tarts. And it shows that even a dumb woman who doesn't know what an assistant vice president does can make Jell-O pudding tarts.
The emotions were high. Our sit-in lasted 11 hours before we came to a compromise. We were prepared to stay all night.
Exhausted, Carter finally agreed to give the occupiers 8 pages in an upcoming issue to write whatever they wanted. Spurred by women's liberationists, the movement looked for a way to make an even splashier public statement.
Theoretically, August the 26th next could be an awful day for American males. That is the 50th anniversary of women's suffrage, and to celebrate it, the women's liberation movement proposes a nationwide strike.
Come join us in the march tomorrow.
On August 26th, feminist leaders summoned women all over the country for a show of force.
It was to be the first mass demonstration of the movement. We didn't have any idea how mass it would be until it happened.
I was scared to death that I would get to Fifth Avenue and see only a small group. When I got to 59th Street, I couldn't believe it.
I feel the earth move under my feet. I feel the sky tumbling down.
There were thousands and thousands, and you couldn't see the end of it.
You're
In New York and cities across the country, women marched.
At first, the police gave us 2 lanes, but by the time everybody had gotten together, it was clear that 2 lanes wouldn't begin to contain us. So we spilled over, and we took over the entire Fifth Avenue.
It was so joyous. We were running and skipping and jumping, and there were children, and there were men. We took the whole street.
There were women hanging out of the office building windows, cleaning women and secretaries and so on, and they would come down. Marching on Fifth Avenue for ourselves had a great feeling of exhilaration and freedom and community. Community isn't exactly enthusiastic enough, but contagiousness.
No sooner had the marches ended, however, than the national media sneered at them.
Are you going to act like ladies today?
We are women. We act like women.
Why do you have such a small turnout here today?
The tone of much of the coverage of the women's movement was dismissive. It undercounted the number of women who were demonstrating. It suggested that the women who were demonstrating were not representative of everyday women.
The plain truth is that most American men are startled by the idea that American women generally are oppressed. And they've read with relief the Gallup poll showing that 2/3 of the women don't think they're oppressed either.
The general perception was it's a small group of unsatisfied women.
Barbara Walters was one of the few women to fight her way into the exclusive men's club of network news in the 1960s.
The so-called women's movement was heating up. And I remember sending a memo to the president then of NBC News saying, shouldn't we do something on the women's movement? And scrawled on the top of my memo, it said, not enough interest.
With so many feminists in the world today, is a woman's place in the home?
Sometimes television talk show hosts would book radical feminists just to confront them.
The feminists who are here tonight, do you not believe a woman's place is in the home, right?
Of course not. It's a very oppressive concept. It's being used to oppress women and to make them think they're lucky to be slaves.
How many women in the home are slaves?
All women are slaves. They are unpaid. They are unpaid.
Sure enough, the strident views of radical feminists shocked and repelled many Americans.
What I objected to was that they were attacking what I was doing. They weren't talking just about themselves. Their point was that we should all feel that way, and that there was something really stupid about us if we didn't. It was the attack on our intellectual capacity, that if we had a brain in our head, we couldn't be happy changing that baby's diaper.
The oppression of the blacks.
Worried about alienating mainstream America, Betty Friedan tried to distance herself and the movement from the women's liberationists.
All that rubbish about slaves. They need to spend 3 days in a longboat.
No, exaggerate. I'm for motherhood, and I'm for sex, and I'm for men, and two-sex society is here to stay.
Well,
and I deal with the real world.
I believe that she was looking to join society as it existed, and the slightly younger parts of the movement were trying to transform society. And those were kind of 2 different goals.
Friedan was especially wary of lesbians, whom she once referred to as the Lavender Menace.
She feared our enemies would just disregard us as strange or far out or unnatural. Lesbian women were desperate to join the feminist movement. They were, in a way, our first feminists, long before we were. And we were not welcoming them.
Like many women, lesbians had found their voices through the women's movement.
I grew up in a moment when feminism was about to happen. I was ripe and ready for change.
Charlotte Bunch had married when she was 22 years old. But her world was turned upside down when she met fellow activist Rita Mae Brown.
To have somebody like Charlotte in my life, boom, it was an explosion, you know? It was a dream. I didn't have to explain things to her. She didn't have to explain things to me.
I came out as a lesbian and was involved in organizing around an understanding of why sexual choice and diversity was such an important issue and why the control of women's sexuality was central to what happened in the women's movement.
But Bunch and Brown received a cold shoulder from the women's movement itself.
Those women, most of whom were rather privileged and very bright, treated lesbians the way men treated them. That's how it looked to me.
As long as homosexuals keep their sexual preference in private, the same as adulterers and adulteresses.
I think that they were afraid that if we were seen as lesbian, it would defeat the whole movement. And what we were trying to say is, you know, that's to give in to the very forces that you're trying to change.
Well, the gay women left. What else could they do? If they didn't leave, they were being thrown out. And when that energy left, the women's movement suddenly became slower, much more, well, for lack of a better word, tedious.
It wasn't just lesbians who felt excluded. Women of color also saw little in the movement to move them.
I was very interested in women's issues because I was experiencing and had experienced sexism by that time myself. I just didn't see any place for me in it because it didn't seem to include the concerns and the issues of Black women and women of color.
One of the things that women of color and other marginalized women argued is that we have to broaden what you consider to be a women's issue. A woman who's living in public housing in urban Atlanta has a very different notion of what constitutes a women's issue than a professional woman trying to break the glass ceiling.
Disaffected African American women began to talk and write about their own vision of feminism.
We wanted a feminism that took into account not just gender issues and gender oppression, but racial oppression, class oppression. We just wanted the face we saw in the mirror to be reflected in the organizing we were doing.
With Betty Friedan unable to bridge the widening rifts in the movement, there was suddenly room for a new leader to emerge.
Will you welcome, please, Gloria Steinem?
If we didn't have Gloria, we'd have to send down to Central Casting for somebody like that, who, in her own body and presentation, tells you you can be beautiful and have any man you want and still be critical of men and still be a little bit angry.
With all the jokes there are about women's lib and all of that, and then people say, yeah, but what have you finally accomplished, really?
I think that women are changing the way they're thinking about themselves.
She had all these media skills that were so superior to anything anybody else had. Plus, she's drop-dead gorgeous. She transformed the movement. All of a sudden, we had a face, and it wasn't an angry face.
Gloria Steinem grew up in Toledo, Ohio. Her mother had given up a career as a journalist to support her husband's ambitions. Steinem watched her spiral into depression.
I can't even emphasize what it's like. It's like giving up being a person. It's giving up your interests. It's giving up what makes you unique. It's giving up what gives you joy, what you love to do, and become an addendum, a mother of, a wife of.
As a girl, Steinem saw little hope of avoiding the same fate.
The only place I saw female human beings who were doing something different was in the movies. So I took tap dancing lessons and dancing lessons, and I entered contests. Other than that, my ambitions were getting out of Toledo and marrying somebody who had a life I wanted, because I didn't think that I could create a life myself.
Steinem arrived in New York in the early 60s, hoping to forge her own career in journalism. But she found herself stymied at nearly every turn.
I got a few assignments The New York Times assigned me to write about how to put up with an English man. The low point of my life was writing an entire Sunday magazine article about textured stockings for the New York Times. I tried to write about Mayor Lindsay. They gave me his wife to write about.
As the women's movement gathered strength, Steinem looked for opportunities to write about it. In 1969, she covered a public hearing on abortion, which was interrupted by women wanting to tell their own stories.
Women are not going to sit quietly any longer. You are murdering us.
I had had an abortion when I was newly out of college, and had never told anyone.
All right, will you please sit down or be removed from the...
No, we aren't going to sit down. Why don't you give us some solid answers to our questions?
I listened to these women testify about all that they had to go through, what it was like to enter into a criminal underground and risk your health and perhaps your life. So I came back and I wrote about it. After I wrote it, my male colleagues on New York Magazine took me aside and they said, look, do not get involved with these crazy women. You know, you've worked hard to be taken seriously. Do not get involved. And I thought, they don't know who I am and it's not their fault because I haven't told them.
Awakened to her own deep anger, Steinem began to speak out in public herself.
2 or 3 years ago, I wouldn't have had the courage to speak before this audience. Now, thanks to the spirit of equality in the air, I no longer accept society's judgment that my group is second class.
I was just caught up in the contagion of it, and it made so much sense of my life and everybody else's life, and I just wanted to say it. I wanted to write it and speak it.
Steinem believed that feminism would never be given a fair hearing in the magazines she wrote for. So she started her own, with a group of other successful journalists. They called it Ms.
Almost all of us have worked for other magazines, especially women's magazines, which we didn't read. They simply didn't say what are the truths of women's lives. And that's basically what we want this to be, a place where women can tell the truth, can read the truth, can get advice.
Welcome to chaos.
The major media immediately predicted the demise of Ms.
They've said it all in the first little issue. I can imagine some stark anti-sexist editorial meeting trying to decide what to do next. After you've done marriage contracts, role exchanging, and the female identity crisis, what do? Organic foods for Christmas dinner, I suppose.
Our first issue sold out in 8 days. It was supposed to be on sale for 8 weeks. It was the talk of the town in New York, and wherever I went, people were just fascinated because here we were coming along and talking about women who were punched around and fighting back. How to look at your own cervix, how to let your body hair grow because otherwise you're a slave to your tweezers, you know. These were completely astonishing articles, so of course we were the talk of the town.
When I got to college, Ms. Magazine and Gloria Steinem made, I think, all women and girls sit up and think, wow, you know, maybe there's more than meets the eye here. It challenged our own thinking about what we could go and do.
Who is it you're trying to reach?
Everybody. I mean, there is no woman in the country who we are not trying to reach.
Thousands of women got to know the women's movement through Ms. Magazine, and who would say they felt like they knew Gloria. She created a bridge, and we can know this was true because of the letters that came to Ms. Magazine.
They were stories. They were amazing personal responses. I would say the dominant theme was, at last I know I'm not crazy, or at last I know I'm not alone.
One of the readers of Ms. was Rose Garrity, a young mother in Binghamton, New York, trapped in an abusive marriage.
There weren't any domestic violence programs back then. Nobody talked about it. It wasn't even whispered anyplace. I kept hoping it would get better. I kept hoping that it would stop. I'll never forget the Ms. Magazine. It was the first I'd ever heard it mentioned anyplace besides in my own home. and start to have an awareness that this is going on with other people and it's not so much about me or us, but that it's a bigger issue.
Risking the wrath of her husband, Rose smuggled copies of Ms. and other feminist publications into an old blanket chest in her home.
If I thought I was going to be alone for an hour, I would slip it out of the blanket chest and read it for a while. Ms. Magazine was a big lifeline for me because it was my only window into the outside world, a world radically different from where I lived and anything I knew.
I humbly admit that I was wrong when I predicted that Ms., the magazine of women's liberation, would fold after 5 or fewer issues. Issue 7 is now in the stands. Ms. has every right to feel proud.
As Ms. Magazine widened the reach of feminism, it helped usher in a new era of the women's movement. In the years to come, the movement would migrate from an outsider's insurgency to the mainstream of American life, where it would lay siege to the country's most established institutions, even the relationship between men and women.
On the next Makers.
And I said, today's girls, we don't want to be our mothers.
From politics.
We were breaking new ground.
To playing fields.
I knew I had to win.
The movement broadens.
Listen, honey, if men could get pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament.
Then it hits a buzzsaw.
The main trouble with the feminist movement is that it teaches women to be victims.
All on the next Makers. To watch any part of the program you missed or explore more inspirational stories from the women who make America, visit pbs.org/makers and join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag MakersChat. Makers, Women Who Make America is available on DVD. To order, visit shoppbs.org or call us at 1-800-PLAY-PBS. Makers is also available on iTunes.
These boots are made for walking, and that's just what they'll do. One of these days these boots are gonna walk all over you. Yeah.